What's up, guys? Johnny here. Welcome back, and man, do I have a good one for you today. Real excited to bring this to you. There's always so much talk going around about we need to slow down racing. We need to bring in spec racing. We do slow spec, and specifically slow specs. We're seeing a lot of talk about easy specs, where it's take your 6S quad, 1700 kV, run it on 4S instead of 6S. Saw one recently for running 1700 kV on 3S. Basically 50% power. Seeing other things where it's a little bit faster, but at least we know it's stock. And the big discussion we always talk about is, we don't want the guy winning because he has the best toys. We want to win because of skill, and we want to take racing and bring it closer. The closer the racing, the more fun it is. Now, first thing I'm going to say right now is the closer racing is, the more fun it is, without a doubt. And something that we could do to help that out, I'm all for it. That sounds fantastic. I want more close racing. But always, what we hear is spec racing is the answer. We got to make it happen. We always have so many discussions, and yet we never have a spec and a standard, and it goes on and on and on. Anyway, want to jump straight to it. What are we talking about specifically today? So before we get straight to the numbers, before we get straight to the video, before we get straight to the analysis of what happened, I want to share the backstory of this. We have a pilot out here in Detroit. He goes by the name of Cappy1. I guess I'd call him kind of like the second tier of pilots. He's an extremely fast pilot, probably top 5-10% of pilots in the country. And he's practicing his butt off. I think he's currently ranked number 82 in the multi-GP global qualifier leaderboard. So he has a really fast time. If you go back, he has a number of podiums at local Detroit races. If you go back to the Bradford, Ohio race, which was a really intense competition, we had Nurk was out there, I was there, we had K-Mead out of Cleveland, we had Beast Mode from Detroit, many other Detroit guys were all there, and Cappy managed to earn himself a podium spot, number 3 behind Nurk, myself, and then Cappy. So he's a very capable pilot, and he's out there practicing all the time. So one of the days I was down at the field, he got to talking to me, he said, help me out. How do I take my racing to the next level? And I decided to throw the goggles on. I was like, hey, you know what? I'm going to put the goggles on, go fly. I want to watch what you're doing so we can talk about it and figure out how to get this done together. So he goes up and flying. The very first piece of advice I have for him is clean your lens. It really helps if you can see. So bear with that a little bit. But while he was flying, one thing was immediately clear to me is that he flies at a fast pace. He's very comfortable with his quad going at a high rate of speed, using a lot of throttle, and still going through gates. So that's a really big strength, I think, of his. But as I was watching it, there were certain obstacles that as he was doing them, he just was not keeping them tight around those obstacles. And I explained where they were on this track. If I remember correctly, that specific one, there's a couple turnarounds like the ladder. He was just really blowing that one out each time. And I showed him where he could kind of, tighten that up and how much time it would save if he could do it. Now, fast forward to the next step, what we said is, you know what? The way to get this done to show tightening up lines and how effective they can be, let's run throttle cap races, me versus you. Let's start at 50% throttle, slow it down to the half speed. So that's almost like doing a 6S quad on 3S battery. Now, what I will say though is because we're doing it with throttle caps, we both run very similar setups. Both his quad and my quad, they're both running the exact same motors. They're the Talon 1860 kV 2207 plus motors. We run very similar stacks. I'm using either a Floss 3 or a Floss 3L, depending on which race it was. He's running a Detroit Multi-Rotors Chaos frame. So they're almost the same exact quads. Mine might be 10 to 20 grams less than his, but they're very similar. So doing a throttle cap, we're getting similar numbers because we're running similar motors. Anyway, fast forwarding a little bit, what we're talking about here is that the expectation that we were going to see was that when we're racing at 50%, you slow racing way down, I won't be able to pull away from him as much. And the way that you really see us pulling away is the difference in the lines. But going that slow, it should be easier to tighten up those lines and keep it close racing. So that was the idea we were entering with this. Do it at 50%, get our times really close so we can see how I'm doing it. Bump up the throttle so it's a little bit harder to keep up. See how I'm doing the line, see if you can keep up and see the difference, and then go 60, 70, 80, 100%. So what we expected to see was at 50%, we have the closest racing. We could analyze, at what point, at what speed does he kind of start falling behind. But I'm just going to jump straight into the numbers and conclusions and talk about what we saw, and then get into the race footage and the analysis of why, because we didn't see that at all. We saw something very different, and you're going to find it really interesting. Let's go check that out, and let's have a chat.
All right, so you're taking a look at the courses that we decided to use for these tests. If you watched my last video where I talked about changing throttle caps and the impact it had on me on a track, these will look very, very familiar. So this is the day number 1 of this test. We did it over 2 different days. Just watching this track here, you can see this is me actually flying at 50%, just trying to show roughly what the tracks that we're using. The day 2 track here is actually using 7x6 size gates versus day 1 was using 5x5 foot gates. I really, really, really like the day 2 track. We actually use that for one of our races. It's got some real nice tight sections where you have to keep it tight on like the left turn, then the ladder. I like the flag and the spin around. I feel like this was a great one for really testing out, pilot skill and keeping nice tight lines. Anyway, there's 2 ways that we kind of look at how we can measure this. We're measuring 2 statistics all day in every round, and that was both your fastest lap of the round and your fastest 3 consecutive laps of the round. So right here, we're looking at is the average of the difference for the 3 consecutive laps, or the minimum of the difference. So what that's saying is for each round, how different was our 3 consecutive laps? So you can see on the left there, 7.2 seconds was the average difference every round at 50% throttle between myself and Cappy. You can see that change between 50, 60, 70, 80%. Now, if we take a look at the other way we can take a look at this graph, we actually look at the difference of the average or the difference of the minimum. Now, what this one's actually showing us is at 50%, the difference of the 3 consecutive averages across all the 50% throttle runs, what's the average 3 consecutive laps you had per round? What's the difference there? And likewise, if we look at all the rounds you had at 50%, what's the best 3 consecutive you had across all the rounds? Let's compare those and use that data to see the difference. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is we're talking about different formats of racing. The first one we looked at was really much more like heads-up racing because we're comparing each and every round. How do we do? That's probably what we're most interested in exciting racing with spec racing, but I'm not really sure. I'm curious which part you guys are more interested to, for that information. Now, the second model is really if we're doing a qualifying day. So fastest 3 consecutive laps qualifying, that's really what that's going to highlight and show for us. Now, remember that when we started this whole thing, we had a starting hypothesis, which was that the lower the throttle percentage, the more we're cutting off the throttle, the closer the racing would be. And that's not quite what we're seeing here. But if we follow along these lines and try to figure out what could possibly explain this, if our theory is correct, I think you'd see that the 7.3 for the average difference, that maybe could be explained by this is the start of the day. It's the first thing we're doing. It took longer for Cappy to warm up, and that's why there's a bigger difference there. But once we're warmed up and going 60, 70, 80%, you can see that number going up on average, even though the minimum, the actual recorded time you'd have in a day of qualifying is going, pretty much going down. That would imply that maybe he can get a little bit faster as he has more to work with, but the consistency is actually going down. Now, keep in mind, we did do about 10 rounds, I believe, at 50%, so there should have been time to warm up, but maybe that's what's going on here. So if we actually go over and take a look at the standard deviation, which gives us an illustration of roughly what the consistency is, you can see in blue is, my consistency standard deviation value versus Cappy's. So you can see that at the start of the day, and also once we get up to higher 80% throttles, he really had a hard time keeping it consistent, but you can also see going from 60 to 70 to 80%, that consistency really changed for him quite significantly, where, at his best, he'd have an easier time competing, but, not quite all the time. So now let's take a look at what happens when we look at the single lap, your fastest lap of a given round, and compare that. So again, if we're going by the theory that maybe it's harder to be consistent, but at its best, he can do better by reducing it to fewer laps. Hopefully we're getting the best of his output to kind of see. And that kind of lines up here. If you actually look at the average lap, we're seeing that go down across the different rounds. If you look at the minimum lap amount, it's pretty much going down until we get to 100%. So we are seeing that at our best, the rounds are, or the single laps are as close as they are, the more speed we actually have, even though the consistency seems to be going away. And that's how we're seeing a little bit more variance in the fastest 3 consecutive, as well as really illustrated in that standard deviation value. So now going back to the average of the difference chart, again, this is looking at heads-up racing style. Every single round, what was the difference between the two different pilots? I really feel like this is the one that we really should be looking at the most when we're talking about spec class racing having more fun, because it basically means every time you go up and fly, how close together are you? It's when you can see that other pilot, but you have the chance of catching up to him. That's when racing is at its most fun. And what you see here, looking at the the average difference, is that going from 50% to 60%, things got closer. Going from 60 to 70%, it pretty much stayed the same. And then once we get up to 80 and 100%, that's where it got a little bit out of control. And it looks like it was primarily due to just not being able to be consistent for Cappy. The minimum difference, the closest race we had, wasn't that far off, but it still was a ways off. Now, this was really, really fascinating to me. I thought it would be kind of a clear line going up. So anyway, when we had a chance to go and try it on a new track, we decided to do the whole testing in, starting at 50%, working our way up. So let's go take a look at that data and see if it lines up with what we're seeing here. All right, so now look at this. The first thought is, what the hell is happening here in day number 2? So again, the theory was that as we go from lower to higher throttles, the difference between the pilots should increase. And yet we're seeing almost the opposite, at least in the beginning. So even if you look at that minimum difference between us, 50%, 5.2, 60%, 5.2, 1.6 seconds minimum difference is 70%. That's over our closest racing. Again, this average is showing on each round what's the difference in our fastest 3 between myself and with Cappy. So on average at 50%, there's a really big difference compared to at 60%. Right? So we're getting closer as we're going to 60%. Then on average, we're getting closer at 70%. So just really, really, really surprising numbers here looking at fastest 3 consecutive. Things are not following the theory. They're supposed to get closer. Now, looking at the fastest lap times as well, you're seeing kind of a similar trend. At our fastest, even up to 80%, the fastest laps are getting closer as we start adding more and more throttle between myself and Cappy. So 0.7 seconds difference is our minimum of our difference as we're starting to race at 80%. On average, we're down to 1.4 seconds at 80% versus 2.1 at 50%. Again, this does not line up with the theory that racing will be faster the more we slow it down. Racing will be closer the more that we slow it down. So switching things up again, looking at it from a qualifying perspective, your best single round, looking at that difference in the minimum 3 consecutive, you can see it stays kind of consistent 50, 60, 70, but we actually get closer at 80%. Even if you look at it from what our average 3 consecutive difference is, it's getting closer after we get away from 50%. That 50% number just is not giving us the closest racing we'd expect. So let's go ahead and take a look at our standard deviation values and see if we're having that same sort of consistency issues that we're seeing on the last day. All right, so now that we're looking at the day 2 numbers for our standard deviation, we see that a consistent pattern is emerging. And the outlier here really is that 50% racing. Just both days, Cappy seemed to struggle with the 50% being that slow. It just was hurting him for some reason. We'll have to go look at the footage and see if we can figure that out. Because he was actually really consistent this day at 60%. I was super consistent at 60%. And then as we moved up 70, 80, 100%, he got less and less consistent. My consistency stayed relatively similar, with 60% being my outlier, 70% being a little bit higher, but overall pretty consistent across all the different ranges. But so far that's kind of lining up that the faster the quad is, the harder it is to keep consistent lines, but at the same point, the higher the potential is to fly really fast and, have competitive racing. So with all that in mind, let's go take a look at the footage and see if we can figure out what's going on. So here, if you watch the 2 pieces of footage, we're both flying at 50%. If you look at the left, you see myself. If you look at the right, you see Cappy flying. You can see there's already developing a pretty big gap in this one. Again, I didn't get all the footage from Cappy, so I can't necessarily say this is what happened in his best round or worst round. I don't know what's what. I just know this is one of his rounds at 50%. Now, one thing that really stood out to me watching his feet on the right now is this corkscrew here. That's a really wide corkscrew. I think what we're going to see is that wide turn is similar to the line he takes when he's flying at 80 or 100%. And that's where you're really losing a lot of time when we start flying at 50%. So you can see there the corkscrew on the left for myself, it was really, really tight. I think that lets me get way ahead versus he swings way out. That one particular obstacle alone, I think is costing him a huge amount of time. And just, it is so hard to make up for time when you're flying at 50% because, on the other side of myself, I'm flying basically full stick for most of this. And because we both have the same speed, slow quads, there's just not room to catch up on the course. So when you get to the total time of, the actual race at 50%, the difference actually grows is what you're seeing versus, when the quads are faster and they're more able to make up in certain spots, or if you take a wider turn, you can do it at higher speed to maybe make up for some of the bad lines. As you can see here with this one, the difference in 50% is just massive and it just keeps getting bigger. So clearly the half speed between myself and Cappy it was not making for the closer racing that we thought. So moving on to the 60% this time. So now the quads are moving a little bit faster. There's a little bit more room to kind of get out in front. You can tell these are not from the same flights. You actually saw Cappy in my view briefly on the left, but you didn't see it on the right. So it's slightly different. But you can see he's looking noticeably better flying now at 60%. His lines actually look a little bit better to me. A little bit wide there. Really nice through the dive. But again, this is the big part here is the corkscrew. That was actually significantly nicer. Again, you can see me passing him there. So different runs. But he's looking really good flying at 60% until he made a mistake there. But even just going from 50 to 60%, you can see that the lines actually got tighter for him, which really did not match my expectation. Watching the corkscrew again, not perfectly tight, but significantly tighter than we were seeing before. So definitely there's an improvement going on now that we're flying at 60%. Which is really interesting to me. I mean, the race is much, much closer. It's still a big difference, but it looks much closer. Real nice dive by him there. Watch the corkscrew again. Yeah, he's definitely cleaning things up once he had more power to kind of keep it tight. So what that kind of tells me is I think what he's doing is he's relying more on the power to try to keep that line tight than the point at which he's turning to keep that line tight. So moving on to 70%, looking at this one now, really what I'm looking for is the line getting tighter or worse, especially around this corkscrew here? So that one looked really, really wide. Looked almost like we were seeing at the 50% number, but maybe it's just his first time. Not too bad in the ladder. Looks pretty good. That was definitely wide there going over the little split S. So watching lap number 2, really nice and clean through that dive. He's got that down. All right, he tightened the corkscrew up quite a bit, looking more like he did at 60%. We're just going at a faster speed now. Really nice and tight in that ladder. And again, a little bit wide there in that last split S. So he's definitely making improvements in his lines, it looks like to me, as he's going up in his throttle. Well, and then again, like we talked about, inconsistencies as the throttle goes up too. So at his best, the lines are better lap times, but they're a little bit inconsistent. That was a really nice split S right there. You could see the pass there from when we were actually flying. Yeah, and still a little wide there. So a little bit inconsistent, but overall it looks like I'm seeing faster laps, which matches the data that we're seeing. It looks like he's using that throttle to kind of compensate for the less than ideal, I would say, line. Not that I necessarily know what the ideal line is, but it looks like that's where the difference is really coming from. And again, a wide corkscrew there that's going to catch him up. All right, so moving on to 80%. The pace of racing is getting significantly faster for both of us. We're both moving faster on the course. If you see the blue LEDs out there, that's actually me flying with him. Looks like a pretty similar run to what you're seeing on the left. Gives you a relative idea of the difference in speed between the two of us. A little bit of a messy there, split S, having a little bit of trouble with that added speed, maybe keeping it clean. But overall, he's doing very similar lines to what we've seen through the whole thing. Looking at that corkscrew, it looks a lot like the 60% number. Which means the line is not really any better, but with that added throttle and added quad speed, he's able to move through there quicker and getting a much better lap time. And I think that's how we're having kind of closer racing at this time, running 80%. So you can see, again, it is looking pretty good, a little bit wide there. He made a big mistake trying to keep that speed to catch up, and it missed a place in the course. So this run's basically done. But again, it comes down to, we get up to 80%, you're starting to see more of those types of mistakes that result in a little bit worse, higher standard deviation, less consistency. All right, so now we're at the end of the day, moving on to the 100% run. You can see right here, we're actually neck and neck between myself and Cappy. Again, he's a very fast pilot. He likes to use that throttle. He likes to go fast out on the course. And that's how we're actually staying closer at 100% versus what we saw at 50%. His line looked great through the split S there. Again, he's keeping it really, really close in racing, which didn't match our expectation, but still is the way it works. Now, the big thing, what you saw in the corkscrew there, he had the exact same line he had through the 60%. He didn't keep it tight. He made up for it with throttle, but that's how I'm getting my big lead, is keeping those sorts of lines tight. So really, I think it's these sorts of things that he needs to leverage, flying at a slower pace, more of a throttle cut, to learn how to keep those lines tight, and then make sure you do them as you go faster. Again, you saw the ladder there. That got a little bit wild, and that's how we're starting to see a big difference opening up now between us. And again, that comes down to the consistency. So at higher throttles, we're seeing that Cappy has less consistency around the track, but as his best, he's noticeably faster and more competitive.
All right, so that's going to bring us to the conclusion of this one. So what was the lesson learned? The biggest surprise for me was that dropping the speed to half of these quads, again, spec, same quads, spec quads, slow quads, did not result in the kind of racing that we expected. But I think what we did learn is that the consistency, for the most part, did get better as the quads got slower. Maybe 50% is just too slow, where some guys are going to struggle because it's so slow that, the 60% number is actually a better fit. Obviously 60% is arbitrary. It'd be related to the motors, the KV, percentage of the RPMs, etc., blah, blah, blah. But I think we did see that the consistency changed. So what that tells me is I think it's still going to be a huge difference when you're talking about comparing two pilots that are of two different levels. Having that spec almost seemed like it was possible to have a bigger difference than we did when running at full speed for the difference between myself and Cappy. But I think what you will see is that pilots at similar skill levels, they'll be more consistently battling for finishes. So I don't think it's necessarily that the best and their best will be any more different than they are, but instead more of the rounds they run and race head-to-head will be close finishes because it's easier to be consistent. And I think that's really what we should be focusing on, is maybe that's where it's a lot more fun, is just more of the races you have with people of similar skills will result in closer finishing and more fun racing, and that means more fun racing for the majority of pilots. But the way it's always pitched and portrayed is that, are you sick and tired of the kid running blah, blah, blah and being so much faster because of his twitch reflexes or his faster quad or whatever? I don't think that part is actually true. I think that the faster, more skilled pilot, that even when you slow it down, they're still going to win by quite a bit, but we get that better racing for guys of similar skill levels. And if we keep focusing on that side of it, maybe we'll have more luck versus focusing on, hey, now you can go compete with Alex Vanover or Evan Turner or those guys. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. So I found this whole experiment really, really fascinating. The results were not at all what I expected. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this and you learned something too. Love to hear from you. Leave a comment down below. Like it if this helped, if you want more content like this. And as always, I'll catch y'all next time. Peace!